Introduction to Interpretive Work units in grades 6 through 8 are part of Inquiry by Design's Introduction to Argument series. In this unit, which follows a similar pattern at each grade level, students move through a cycle of work with 2 different pieces of short fiction, and for each story, they write an interpretive argument. While students will have read and talked about a few different texts in the first unit, this unit introduces more of the close reading practices that will become common throughout the year. The cycle of work can be shown in this image here. With each text, there's a whole class teacher-led first reading, followed by some comprehension work with the story. And once students have a decent understanding of the characters and events, they're given an interpretive question to consider, first in small groups, then to discuss as a whole class. These discussions provide the foundation for students' writing work, in which they respond to the same interpretive question they've been talking about with their peers. This writing provides an opportunity to discuss the key elements of argumentation, and before students write the second argument, the teacher pulls examples of work from the first assignment to examine and reflect on together. Let's take a closer look at one of the units, in this case, 6th grades. The first session introduces a little bit of the focus of the unit and the first author, and then moves right into the first read. During this reading, students are following along, marking annotations in the text as appropriate, and considering a few broad comprehension questions like, who are the characters and what do we learn about them? What are the big events in the story, and in what order do they happen? Afterward, they discuss those questions in small groups. These questions are deliberately broad and open-ended. We aren't trying to lead students through a long list of specific details. Rather, we're asking them to go back into the text and make sure that they have a basically coherent understanding of it. We don't expect them to be experts on it here. Remember that they will continue working with the text for several more sessions, and this is simply the first pass at it. In the next session, they wrap up their work on these questions, and the teacher debriefs the students as a whole class, charting students' thinking. The idea here is just to make sure that students have a decent understanding of the literal content of the story. As students share their responses, ask for clarification when necessary, or for examples or specific instances. Jot this thinking down in either a digital document or a chart that can be displayed for students to refer back to throughout the unit. At the end of this work, students reflect on the kinds of things they did in order to understand the text. And after writing their own lists, the teacher collects student responses on another chart, essentially forming a list of comprehension strategies. The third session introduces the interpretive question. In this focus lesson, teachers discuss with students some of the fundamental components of an argument: claims, evidence, explanation, and students move into small groups to think about the question together. We emphasize that there's not a right or a wrong answer we're looking for. This isn't a hunt for a predetermined response. Instead, this is time for students to go back into the text, form tentative ideas, test out theories, and build their reasoning together in preparation for a whole class discussion in the next session. Prior to the whole class discussion, students are given a few minutes to quick write their thinking. This serves multiple purposes. First, it pushes students to organize their ideas a bit more clearly and specifically in advance of the discussion. It can also serve as a springboard for the start of that conversation in a moment, or as a tool to fall back on during the discussion when necessary. The discussion is an important part of this and every unit's work. Here, students lead the work, and their voices and ideas are what matters. By and large, the teacher's role in this is to take note of student ideas, make sure all students have an opportunity to engage, and ask occasional follow-up questions to allow students to clarify or specify. With this unit coming early in the year, know that it may take practice over time, and that there may be some quiet stretches. That's okay. Take a look at the note included before Session 4, Establishing a Strong Culture of Discussion, for a few general recommendations. After the discussion, students take a moment to reflect on the conversation, add any new ideas or evidence to their quick writes, and then just like they did after the comprehension work, they engage in a bit of metacognitive reflection about forming interpretations. What did they do? How is it different from comprehension work? What did they learn about this work? Before Session 5, which introduces the writing task, you may wish to lead students through this intersession, which comes from our Writing Text-Based Arguments manual in the form guide. Essentially, you solicit student thinking about what makes strong interpretive writing, and you list student responses in different categories. During this process, those categories don't have names, but you should know in advance that you'll ultimately title those charts with the categories from the writing rubric. After students share their initial thinking, the class reads through an example of strong interpretive writing, perhaps an example from a previous year or from a current publication that's selected for student interest, etc. Then you gather more ideas about strong writing before labeling each chart. You'd then pass out a copy of the rubric and lead students through some work comparing their own criteria with the details in the rubric, preferably just looking at one section to start with. This allows you to begin introducing the rubric language and some of your expectations prior to the writing work of the next session. In session 5, students share their thinking about the differences between interpretation and comprehension work, review the expectations for the writing task, and write their responses. You may choose to extend this writing across a second session. Afterward, you can consider whether you wish to follow up on student writing with any of the options described. The second half of the unit mirrors the first. Essentially, students get to practice their close reading and interpretive skills on a second text, and as they come to the writing task, they review examples from the first response to help guide their writing. If you're beginning your initial planning for this unit, this is a good time to open up your grade level teacher manual and the student reader and to take a look at some of the important planning features. In particular, you'll want to take a look at the introduction for the unit, as well as the at a glance section where you can see how sessions are organized, and of course the major tasks in the unit, which you can find in the sessions themselves or in the appendix of the unit. With these things in mind, give yourself the time to take a slow, thoughtful read of the texts. Then, looking at all of the work between the texts and the teacher manual, you might take 20 to 30 minutes to review everything, and the idea here is just to get a sense of the structure and the intended flow of the work, not to settle every lingering question you have about it. If you're planning with peers, hold on to some of those questions for the more detailed review afterward. Once you've had the chance to read the stories and review the general structure of the unit, there are a couple more things you can do to help prepare for this unit in advance. One is, quite simply, to sit down and talk about these texts with your peers. If you're able to set aside instructional concerns for a moment and just ponder the stories aloud with a colleague through the lens of the interpretive questions, it should help you feel a little more grounded in the work that you'll be doing with them. After having spent some time with the texts, you should look more closely at each of the tasks that students are expected to do with them. How does each session's work build on the previous sessions? What do you notice about the writing task sheets that you want to plan for in advance? Given that this will be students' first argument writing of the year, what do you most want to emphasize with them? While the sessions can be completed as written, you're welcome to take a look at Inquiry by Design's form guide or the targeted writing lessons to start generating ideas of how to continue coaching students in their academic writing. So, once again, here are my recommendations for next steps. Make use of any opportunity here to talk about some of the texts with your colleagues. Chances are each text will strike each person a little differently, and we all gain from each other's insight. So we often say people get smarter together. Take a close look at the tasks and the rubrics associated with the unit. Which elements are most essential to your planning, given what you know about your students' writing? Lastly, make some notes about how you hope to see students strengthen their academic conversations and writing in this unit. Are there any additional IBD resources you want to draw on to support this? That might include the form guide or the targeted writing lessons, or even some of the reflection tools found in the portfolio section of the correctness guide. Having an opportunity to meet together and work with these units in an as-learner experience is always going to give us the strongest understanding of how these units play out, and frankly, it's more fun. But this introduction should help paint some of the broad strokes of the work, and ideally, you'll be able to use some of these questions to think through the unit in advance and to spend some time in conversation with your peers.